Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to sculpt a hand in clay. Hopefully I can offer you guys some tips and tricks that'll be helpful to you in your own sculpting careers. So let's start with our tools. I try and use as few as possible since it's really easy to end up with ones that you don't need and just a tackle box full of junk. So we'll start with the bigger ones and then work our way down to the finer ones. This first guy is a big metal scraper for cutting away the larger forms. It's great for just blocking out the big shapes and cutting away the clay that you don't need. Next up's a wooden spatula used for shifting around the clay and refining the forms. This is a rake tool, which you'll get into when you want to smooth things down. It's got these great little serrated edges that strip off all the lumpy bits, but they don't dig too deep into the clay, so you won't mess things up too badly. These are some loop tools. So once you've got your sculpt all smoothed out, you'll want to use these for the finer details like wrinkles, folds, and hair. Finally, here's some solvents for smoothing things down. Usually I'll do a combo of isopropyl alcohol with something like Mr. Clean or terpenoid, or if you can get your hands on it, this stuff called Taltine works great as well. The clay I'm going to be using is medium Chavant clay, which is oil-based, so you can pretty much work on this forever and it'll never dry on you. You can use harder clay for things like small hands and heads, but for this purpose, medium's going to be fine. I'm not sure what you would want to use soft for. It would probably get a little too messy and mushy for you. Alright, let's get our clay ready. You'll want to chop it up into workable sized chunks, maybe an inch across, and then throw them in something like a toaster oven. I just bought a really junky one at a hardware store. You want it at a really low heat, just enough to soften the clay, but not enough to melt it so that it just becomes liquid lava. It can really hurt your hands. So we'll just put that in and leave it in for a bit. While our clay is warming up, we can make our base. To do this, just drill a hole in the bottom of like a 2-inch thick board and take some armature wire and some epoxy glue. You'll mix it together and put it in the hole for about 5 minutes to let it set. This armature might be a little bit overkill for what we're doing, which is just a hand, but there's nothing worse than having your sculpture just plonk onto the floor. That'll just ruin your day really quickly. So it's good to have things really locked into place. Make sure to score the bottom of the armature wire before you put it in. This gives the epoxy something to hold on to. Once that's in there, I'm just going to give it something to stand on and let that sit for about 5 minutes. Once that's all set up, wrap a thinner armature wire around it. I can't really even call this an armature wire since it's literally just a stick sticking out of the wood, but this will give the clay something to latch onto. With everything set up, we can actually start sculpting now. So the goal here is to just block out the clay. You're not making a masterpiece or anything, you're just getting the clay together in its basic shapes. So like a square to represent the palm, a triangle for the thumb to plug into. I'm not even going to model fingers just yet, I'm just going to make a big square to represent all of them for now. You'll see I'm also using one of those big spatula tools to quickly chop off any extra clay there. Also, sorry in advance if my pasty white desk jockey hands keep getting in the way. I'm going to try and keep them clear as best as possible. I chose to model my hand, by the way, just because you've got pretty much instant reference. You can model your own hand, and it's a great thing to practice on. You don't need to go out and bug somebody to model for you or anything like that. So here I'm starting to make some divisions to separate the fingers. You basically make 3 triangles that go down half the length of the hand. Once those are done, I'm going to just start chopping off the extra bits just to get the length of them right. Obviously the middle finger's the longest and the pinky's the shortest, that sort of thing. Just kind of eyeballing it right now. Once those guys are separated, we're also going to need a thumb. So I'm going to make up a rectangular shape that's about the same length as my triangular palm shape and just plug that on. You just mush this clay on with your fingers and it'll stick really well. That's the really great magic of this type of clay, is it's quite flexible. You could almost think of sculpting with clay just like you would be doing it in 3D if you're familiar with working in ZBrush or anything like that. You start at subdivision level 1, which is super ugly, and then you divide it a little bit more and round off the edges. Or if you're in Maya, you'd bevel those edges and round off the squares. Once you're done with that, you'd start adding in the little finer details like the knuckles, and the fingernails, and then after that you divide again and then go on onto the wrinkles. So you just got to keep doing it step by step and refining it more and more. So speaking of that, what I'm doing here is just rounding off the hard edges to all our blocked in shapes, using my hands, and then I'm going to start using that loop tool just because you can get a little bit more accurate with things in certain places. I haven't mounted this to the base, by the way, just because I like to have a little bit more flexibility while I'm working right off the bat. I can rotate it around, and I'm not constrained just to the wood board. I'm also not quite sure what the pose of this hand is going to be yet. So I find it's just better to work freely this way, just for now. So you'll see here that a finger just fell off, and I'm going to reattach it with a lighter and just brush out the seam. And that's the great thing about this clay. It'll never dry on you. You're totally flexible to take stuff off and work on it separately. You can melt it, you can freeze it, you can leave it in the closet forever, and then take it out when you want to work on it again. So I find it's a really great material and very forgiving to work with. This next bit, I'm just going to focus on cleaning things up with just my hands. Rounding off all the areas, adjusting the proportions, making sure my finger lengths are correct. Stripping off any clay that there's extra amounts. You can see here, I'm actually going to just start rounding out the back of the hand with my thumb. And also, I think the palm where the thumb is going to need a little bit of meat there, so I'm just going to add in a ball of clay and smooth that in. All right, now that the hand's in somewhat decent shape, it's got 4 fingers and a thumb. It's not going to win any awards or anything. I'm going to start making up a wrist just so we can mount it to the base. You don't want to work on one part of your model too much and then neglect another. So I'm just going to do a preliminary pose with these fingers and just melt the ends of the wrist and the bottom of the hand and plug it on and just let that clay cool for a few seconds. You can kind of see as I'm posing these that the fingers are getting pretty mushed up and manhandled. So this is kind of a good reason why you would hold off on doing any smaller details until after posing, because you'll just mess them up. Okay, magically that hand is on. Sorry, I forgot to film that part. So right now we've got all the pieces together and we can actually start refining things now and adjusting the pose and starting to nitpick things a little bit more. So I'm starting to use more tools now and, defining the joints and things, adding in some knuckles and adding in some wrinkles. To do the knuckles, by the way, just roll up a small oval of clay and you press that on pretty firmly, and then you can just blend that in on either side with the like the wooden end of your loop tool. I'm just drawing in with the end of the loop tool here, just some indications of folds and wrinkles. Once those are in, I'll go in later on and pull out with a smaller loop tool from either end to round them off, and that'll give you kind of an instant fatty fold. So I'm going to take the fingers off now just to work on them separately. It's a lot easier and you can get all the tricky angles without having to work around the rest of the hand. Still drawing in with that loop tool, just indicating quickly where those deep folds are going to go. It's good to go pretty fast at this point. This isn't a part that you need to go slow and delicate with. You could almost think of this like you're doing a gestural figure drawing. You just want to get it down as fast as possible. Now I'm using that smaller loop tool and pulling out from either side. So you start from the center and you just round out those folds. And once that gets smoothed down with our solvents, it'll look great after that. Remember when you're posing things out how objects squash and stretch. So the underside of the fingers where they're bending, that's going to look fattier and more rounded, while the top is going to be quite taut. So go in there where you need to bulge things out and just add little bits of clay in and round those off to get those nice forms. That thumb's looking a little bit long right now. Unfortunately, there's no transpose tool like you find in ZBrush, so we're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way and just cut it in half and then reattach it. But that's just part of the fun of doing this kind of clay sculpting. And don't be afraid to get back in there with your fingers and mold them with your hands. I find the further on in the project you get really reliant on your tools and you forget to use your fingers, which are actually the most important part, the most important tools that you've got. Going to add some fingernails now. Remember that they kind of go halfway between the end of the finger and that last knuckle. To do them, just press your wood tool down right into them and round out the end of the finger there. Once I'm reasonably confident with where everything's placed, I'm going to start raking it down a bit. This is less to do with the polishing at this point and more just so I can make sense of everything that I've put down so far. There's still a lot of junky looking bits and clay blobs sticking out, so this just cleans it out so I can make sense of everything. You'll notice too when you start to smooth things down that the mistakes really start to show through and the errors in your proportions. It starts to enter into this kind of uncanny valley territory where it's smooth and starting to get polished, but like a thumb is too long, a finger's misplaced, which is unfortunate because it takes a lot to polish your model, and then you see those mistakes. So you just got to go back in and fix them if you can catch them. If you're happy with the proportions of your model and you want to move forward, we can get into making some more detail, like adding tendons and veins. To do those, just roll up some tubes of clay and press them down pretty firmly into your model. If you don't push down hard enough, they can come off when you rake over them. So once those are on, you pull away from either side of them to blend them into the rest of your sculpt. Try to blend your veins and stuff down as much as you can with your rake tool to the point where they almost disappear. If they bulge out too much, it can give you kind of a cartoony look if they're too extreme. When I mentioned earlier that I like to put my sculpts in the closet, that actually wasn't a joke. Usually I work on about three at a time, and when I'm just getting sick of looking at it or I can't figure out a certain problem, I'll just put it away and forget I even worked on the thing. And it's amazing when you take it out after that long of not looking at it, suddenly all the little problems that you're having start to show through and you can instantly recognize them and you're not precious about fixing them. You know, if something's too long or too short, you just chop into it and you make those fixes. I find it really helpful. So, yeah, if you don't have a deadline, I just highly recommend doing that. Going in again and drawing in some more folds and wrinkles with that loop tool. Same thing, you draw a line and then pull out from either side to round it off. When you're doing these wrinkles, try and do them in steps so that one isn't right on top of each other but is slightly to the left or slightly to the right. And you just keep going back and forth. You don't want an even row of lines all the way down the side of your hand. Where things are really compressing, I'm going to start adding in a little bit more clay there just to emphasize the kind of the bulgy meatiness of that. Sometimes it's just not enough to draw in those lines for wrinkles, and you actually need to start sculpting in some raised areas. All right, we've got our veins in and tendons, and hopefully our proportions are reasonably correct. So now we can start smoothing this thing down. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. Since Chavant clay is oil based, you can use all different types of solvents on it, like isopropyl alcohol. And here I'm just going to use a little Mr. Clean on it as well, just because it's pretty strong and breaks down the clay a bit better. And I'm going to be using an acid brush here just with the ends cut off. And this acts like a really coarse sandpaper, and you kind of scrub it in circles, and you're basically taking off all the big blobs of clay and preparing it for the next phase of smoothing. Once that's scrubbed down, you can take a rag and then just rub in circles like you're polishing a table, and you're just polishing it as much as you can go. This process can take a while just to get everything really smoothed out. Remember when you're using any of these solvents to really air it out. Even if you chuck out your rags, your sculpt itself can still have all these nasty solvents soaked into it. So it's good to just leave them on the balcony or whatever you can for a little while, just to make sure you're not destroying your brain cells with this stuff. It's pretty hard to smooth out those little crevice areas under the fingers, so I'm just going to take them off so I can work on them separately. That's another great benefit of not actually having an armature for this hand, because if you did, you'd be pretty locked into place and it'd be kind of unflexible. Moving on to the fingers now and just refining those fingernails. I'm going to add a little strip of clay to the very end of the nails and then strip that away just to get a hard edge to that. And just like the rest of the hand, smoothing it down with that alcohol. Once things are smoothed down, you can see where areas are going to need more detail or are undeveloped or need more meat to them. So like where that fingernail is meeting the finger, I'm going to try and add a little bit more meat in there. And you can see here things are falling off and on all the time. If that happens, just melt the ends of it and plug it back on like that. And if you have any freeze spray, hit it with that freeze spray, and you can just work on it a lot quicker. You don't need to wait for it to cool. So that's about it for the hand for now. I'm not sure why I decided to take a fancy picture of it with no fingers attached. So now I'm going to move on to making some clothes for it. I'm just going to spread out a flat sheet of clay. You can use things like pasta rollers to do this, which can be tricky sometimes because the clay can actually stick to the rollers a lot. I'm just going to mush it down with my hands. So once I've got that thin sheet, I'm just going to wrap that around the wrist. Try and do your clothing just like you would the rest of the body by blocking it in, making sure the big forms are correct, finding interesting shapes. And then once you're happy with it, you start going in and adding those little details. So here I'm just going to add in some seam lines there. And it's a total personal taste thing how far you want to go on doing clothing. Some great busts that you'll see just have very simple clothing, and the focus is mostly on the head. Or you can just go bonkers, Bernini style with your folds. It's, totally up to you. So I've skipped ahead and I've just done a bit more smoothing on things, and I'm starting to use an alcohol torch now. This kind of gives you a really nice shiny finish, very smooth. Be careful with it though, because if you go too nuts with it, you can really eradicate detail. So just hit it very delicately, and as soon as you've touched it with that torch, try and have some freeze spray ready so that you can cool it down right away and it doesn't keep on melting on you. So use very lightly. Also, another word of warning is that freeze spray is actually really flammable. And I've had some situations where my sculpt has actually been on fire and you can't really see it. The alcohol's still burning. And if you hit it with that spray can, it'll explode on you. So be very careful because you can really burn the place down. I always like to add little hard surface details to the sculpt whenever I can. I just like that kind of contrast of seeing something very sharp and like plasticky or metal kind of contrasting with the clay. So right here I'm just going to make them up a little button. Making these things are kind of fun because you can be creative on how you make these little props. So I was just using a cutout end of a pen there to mold it. So once that's made up, I'm going to roll up a little blob of clay, melt it, and then just plug that button in there. And now his shirt can tie up. Okay, with a bit more smoothing, that's about it for this hand. Hope this tutorial was of some help to you and you're able to get your hands on some clay and start making your own cool sculpts. Take care.